So, who is in control of Canada? What does old stock Canadian even mean? Weren't we all immigrants? But how can you know when you've become an ethnicity and not just a group of people?
What is a Canadian? This is a question many of us puzzle over while grasping at answers such as tolerance and hockey. These same people detect that there's something insubstantial about these definitions and attempt to trace the roots of their identity to something deeper. Those same people soon understand that the Canadian identity is not a broadly agreed upon song their countrymen sing. Indeed, to half the country, it exists as something of an anti-identity. The Canadian demands to be acknowledged. This begs the question, does Canada even exist? Former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau famously described Canada as a post-nation state.
Every few years, Canada has gone through moments of crisis of identity. Who are we? What are we? What is the Canadian identity? And once you set aside the easy, well, we're not Americans, it has become difficult. I've been using that line for years. It predates the current administration, just before but can we define what the Canadian identity we expect newcomers to join and contribute to is? I mean, one of the things we talk about is that melting pot that some countries have, or the US often has, versus the cultural mosaic that we have. And what does that actually mean? And what lessons do we have for a globalized world in the 21st century?
Many people objected to this statement for a variety of reasons, but those who decried the lack of national identity failed to put forward a coherent argument for what a national identity of Canada ought to be. Is it merely beer and hockey? Or is Canadian identity the prevailing mainstream summary of tolerance and progressivism? Trudeau was simply assessing the reality of Canada's place on the world stage. He was not the center of a conspiracy, but rather broadcasting the victory of a program that was generations in the making. Canada is described by its own state apparatus as an economic zone defined primarily by its tolerance of other cultures and staunch condemnation of its own founding as a shameful act. How did Canadians become a group that denies its own existence? More importantly, what does this mean for the individual groping their way in the hostile darkness, silently believing they deserve to exist? To understand what Canada is, we must understand what a Canadian is, and what a Canadian is has been the subject of decades of aggressive critique. In 1867, during Canadian Confederation, the population of Canada was 92% British and French, 7% other Europeans, half of whom were German, and 2% Black and Indigenous. The colony of Canada was originally founded by the Kingdom of France, part of the vast territory of Nouvelle-France. Jacques Cartier named the region in 1535, and Samuel de Champlain established the first permanent French settlement in North America in 1608 around the empty site of Stadacona and named it Quebec. This settlement would become the largest and most populous administrative hub for the entire territory. Anglo-Canadian identity emerged from Loyalist Americans in the 1760s, though settlement of Canada would begin earlier with New England planters in Nova Scotia. Loyalist Americans were known as Continentals, with a culture distinct from both England and the emergent Revolutionary Americans. With these core demographics in mind, the Canadian Red Ensign was Canada's flag for most of its history. The flag represented the Commonwealth connecting all the main European identities. The coat of arms of Canada, also known as the Shield, eventually became the symbol of Canadian nationalists. Here you see the heraldry of England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. These are the four founding groups who merged into Anglo-Canadian and French-Canadian groupings. The flag was changed to the familiar maple leaf because the previous national symbol was exclusive to the distinct ethnic identity of Canadian founding stock. In 1965, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson changed the flag to the iconic red maple leaf, erasing explicit Anglo-French identity, a signal that Canada was broadening its definition and looking outward.
Brought up at all.
I believe that today a flag designed around the maple leaf will symbolize and be a true reflection of the new Canada.
When a Prime Minister decides that he's going to trample on the things of the spirit, then indeed we've arrived at a position not in keeping with the principles of democracy.
The new flag of Canada there will have to be 4 igloos, 3 totem poles, 2 codfish, and a hint of a fleur-de-lis.
What proceeded from there was the state's official endorsement of globalist multiculturalism as public policy. In July of 1947, the government acknowledged that support for an influx of carefully selected immigrants had increased over the preceding year, a sentiment which purportedly existed as far back as 1944. After large-scale immigration was undertaken during this period, public support for the migration policy dropped drastically, with a disapproval rate of 67% by 1960. The idea that Canada was ever popularly regarded as a nation of immigrants is a piece of revisionist history that stands in opposition to the wealth of record-keeping we have at our disposal. Up until the 1960s, Canada had an explicitly exclusionary immigration policy on paper, yet the groundwork for ethnic replacement was laid in the post-war era in spirit. For example, the Mackenzie King government yielded to international pressure from the UN and turned to softer language when trying to keep out groups such as the Chinese.
There is going to be a great danger of the UN refusing the idea of justifiable rights of selected immigration with racial and other discriminations.
Further still, activist bureaucrats in the Saint Laurent era poked holes in racist decision-making, allowing select groups of non-whites to enter Canada. It took a true anti-racist in the form of Prime Minister John Diefenbaker to allow the total elimination of racial restrictions despite being labeled a nationalist.
John Diefenbaker was a fascinating linchpin because, of course, he himself, although born in the country, was of German-Canadian descent, and he felt very strongly that he was a spokesman for ethnic Canadians, or people who had been seen as hyphenated Canadians. Diefenbaker wanted to erase that hyphenization, and he wanted, in a sense, to recognize people of every ethnicity as equally Canadian.
The transformation occurred incrementally. This process of changing Canada into a multicultural progressive experiment occurred only half a century ago. It's no coincidence that, once rediscovered, the arms of Canada exploded in popularity as the emblem of Canadian nationalists, deeply rooted in the nation's true heritage and history. For a group attempting to rediscover what it actually means to be Canadian, this has proven to be foundational. Conservatives and liberals alike have proven unable to embrace this quest for historical identity, and it is seen as a fringe issue propelled by troublesome old-stock Canadians. Why is ethnic Canadian history such a touchy subject inside the Canadian political establishment? It appears partisan political rivals have more in common than meets the eye. There can be no discussion of Canada in the 21st century if it does not chart the rise of the Liberal Party and the lionization of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. George Grant, in his overview of 1940s Canada, recorded in the landmark book Lament for a Nation, explained how Canada is continually defined as a state in progress, always becoming but having no fixed genesis. The trick of this reasoning is that the longer people genuinely believe this, the further history is distanced, and people will believe that Canada was always a set of porous borders open to the economic interests of the world. A recent history is no history at all, and no history at all means that we can embrace a future of no foundation. George Grant tracks the rise of one of the two main political parties in Canada, the Liberals, their counterparts being the Conservatives, and their alignment with the urban areas, which was aligned with the large corporations that were continental in scope. While tightening ties to America through capital, these private conglomerates introduced another vector allowing for external influence. There is no horizontality to be found here. There's no sense that the extended folkways need to be answered to. The mantra goes, we must embody change now because all we have ever been is change. The future is being constructed in opposition to the past. Our ancestors exist only to keep this progressive conversation going.
The enormity of the break from the past will arouse in the dispossessed youth intense forms of beatness. But, after all, the United States supports a large beat fringe. Joan Baez and Pete Seeger titillate the status quo rather than threaten it. Dissent is built into the fabric of the modern system. We bureaucratize it as much as anything else. Is there any reason to believe French Canada will be any different? A majority of the young is patterned for its place in the bureaucracies. Those who resist such shaping will retreat into a fringe world of pseudo-revolt.
In staking a firm position against conflict, liberalism takes aim at the forces of identity, competitiveness, and a thirst for power. They see Western nationalism as uniquely destructive, and in their minds, whether born from ignorance or fetishization, they view other nationalisms as childish at best. It at once glorifies its multicultural past while ripping down monuments to its history and leaders for not being sufficiently multicultural. To them, the history of Canada is a glory they must bury as soon as possible. It's important to note how all this occurs on the emotional level, as this baseline secular humanity can only be expressed in emotional terms. Francis Fukuyama is one of the most powerful advocates of Western hegemony, which posits that the liberal project of the 20th century has achieved the utopian endpoint of socio-political development, and all that must be done is either export this tolerant, materialistic, individualistic ideology to the rest of the world, or import them into the West, which will force them to be changed by degrees and over the course of generations. The Liberals propose that this pre-nation state be populated by a new man, the last man. The Liberal measures their success by materialist gains and the fulfillment of emotional desires. Groups are not mentioned, only atomized individuals.
In the years prior to the 1980s, a large majority, I would say, of progressive intellectuals believed not only that there would be a progressive modernization as human societies evolved, but that there was also an end of history. And the end of history would be some form of communist utopia. And when I wrote my original article in 1989, I made a very simple observation, which was that I, too, like all of the Marxists, believed that there was this progressive history that was propelling societies to different and more complex levels of social organization, but that it didn't look like we were ever going to get to communism. That whatever seemed to be at the terminal point of this modernization process was some version of a market-based economy and some version of liberal democracy. And so
this is what Canada believes to be its civilizational essence, and more than anything, this informs Liberal Party policy. The inability for conservatives to present a coherent counter-argument ensures that conservatives will inevitably fall in line within this paradigm. This is reflected in the desire of Canada's federal government to champion their values internationally and to become a world leader for the normalization of progressive values. All you need to do is look towards the man who many see as the godfather of modern Canada, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. In a famous essay titled The New Treason of the Intellectuals, he wrote, "The very idea of the nation-state is absurd," pessimistically stating that to have a nation-state one must have an ethnic majority, while minorities constantly carve out their own ethnic enclaves in a state of constant tension and conflict. The answer to this, repeated by his son Justin many years later, was to abolish the nation-state and all traces of even a historic ethnic or national identity. As with the United States of America, Canada can be seen as a fulfillment of these Enlightenment-era British principles rather than a revolt against them, positioning Canada as the vanguards of the age of progress and the belief that they are stewards of an inevitable upwards progress. These political advocates will enthusiastically call this the multicultural experiment, but will deny such an experiment can have a conclusion and thereby a qualitative assessment of the results. The history of Anglo and Franco Confederation is a history that is simultaneously disregarded and denounced. Canadians have been propagandized into believing the experiment of anti-identity never ends. To rediscover what being a Canadian is, we must identify the forces that shepherded us from the widely understood shared vision that existed not so long ago. The full portrait of Canada would be incomplete if we only discussed the Canadian populace and not those populating the power structures. When we speak of mass revolts of regular people that ought to rise up and assert themselves, we must understand the processes through which these movements are controlled and subverted. While we have assessed the liberal role in this experiment, we must acknowledge that the conservative leader Pierre Poilievre described Canada as a place where, quote,
anyone from anywhere can do anything,
representing both ends of the mainstream political spectrum. This is not only pushing seemingly limitless migration, but framing it exclusively in terms of labor and economics. According to writer Brooks Adams, the founding of a great civilization is typically accomplished by a core martial class of men. In the case of Rome, these would be the soldier farmers who exemplified the blood and soil ethos. A synthesis of self-contained culture and duty stronger than the brainwashing of the state, we find it again in those who settled America and in the brave settlers that built Canada. Throughout history, the repeating tragedy is the imaginative man has fallen under the domination of the economic man wherever he emerges. Unfortunately, there never seems to be a return to tradition that occurs on a scale large enough to avert course.
In proportion as movement accelerates, societies consolidate, and as societies consolidate, they pass through a profound intellectual change. Energy ceases to find vent through the imagination and takes the form of capital. Hence, as civilizations advance, the imaginative temperament tends to disappear, while the economic instinct is fostered, and thus substantially new varieties of men come to possess the world.
Great city-states and legendary societies are commonly founded by this martial class of ambitious and violent men, carving their world into the untamed terrain and planting the seeds that grow into formidable trees with the roots of legends. It is these people you may identify with, and you may feel the same yearning of pioneers driven to build something permanent in a chaotic world. In all likelihood, you find yourself at odds with the prevailing sentiment of the times. These men are portrayed as charming yet harmful antiquities by the men and women that dominate today. If your goal is to create a robust community to stand apart from the center of power, you will find yourself beset on all sides by an institutional autoimmune response. It is therefore essential to understand who these oppositional groups are. Where does the power lie in modern Canada, and what groups of economic men are charged with upholding this unique ethnic commonwealth? The Laurentians are an elite faction of power in Canadian politics. Though their institutional centre is firmly based in Ontario, particularly in Ottawa's civil service and Toronto's financial and media core, their origins trace back to the 18th century in Montreal, where a powerful fusion of Anglo-Scottish merchants and French-Canadian seigneurial families formed Canada's first cohesive ruling class. Families like the Molsons, Redpaths, McGills, Allens, and Greenshields dominated industry and finance, while the Cartiers, Vigers, Papineaus, Beaubiens, Dessaules, and Lafontaines anchored the French legal, clerical, and professional elite. Through intermarriage, shared institutions, and political alignment, they created a bicultural but culturally Anglophone elite that governed commerce, education, and the machinery of confederation. Their primary political vehicle became the Liberal Party of Canada, which still serves as the main conduit of their influence. Today, the Laurentians maintain vast patronage networks through the federal and Ontario civil service, academia, welfare-anchored migration, and the public sector unions concentrated in Ontario and the National Capital Region. Their intellectual wing dominates the Canadian university system, and their financial power remains tethered to sectors reliant on state contracts, regulatory capture, and union leadership. Though the old Montreal families laid the groundwork, real power now flows through Ontario's political, bureaucratic, and media institutions, with dynasties like the Desmarais family serving as connective tissue between the Anglo-Quebecois Old Guard and the modern Laurentian state apparatus. This elite continues to set the national narrative through regime media like the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and CBC, all of which reflect a worldview first forged in the salons and boardrooms of Imperial Montreal, but now administered from the heights of Ontario. The Quebecois elite are an ethnic nationalist cohort who see Quebec not as a province but as a nation with its own people, culture, and political destiny. Even the term Quebecois is a modern invention coined during the Quiet Revolution to replace the older identity of Canadien Français, which once linked French speakers across the country through shared faith and heritage. Quebecois reframed that identity as secular, modern, and territorially bound to the province. This new elite emerged in the 1960s when secular technocrats replaced the Catholic clergy and sidelined the Anglo business class. They took over education, healthcare, state corporations like Hydro-Quebec, and built a provincial bureaucracy designed to serve the nation-building project. Their main political vehicles are the Bloc Québécois at the federal level, which advances separatist interests in Ottawa, and the Coalition Avenir Quebec at the provincial level, currently in power. Their strategy works on two levels. First, they extract economic concessions and expanded autonomy from the federal government by keeping the threat of referendum alive. Second, they use language laws and secularism to not just protect the French culture, but to secure ethnic Quebecois control over the provincial state and quietly redirect federal resources into Quebec-run institutions. What presents itself outwardly as a cultural policy is often a calculated form of internal state building, using law, bureaucracy, and long-term planning to build a sovereign infrastructure within the Federation. Rather than aligning with international capital, they built parallel institutions, Hydro-Quebec, Caisse de dépôt, Télé-Québec, Université Laval, and others, all oriented around preserving the nation from assimilation. Though often in open conflict with the Laurentian elite, this Quebecois managerial class mirrors it in structure, top-down, bureaucratic, centrally planned, and patronage-based, but rooted in ethnic nationalism, not multicultural universalism. The Western elite were created by an elite fracture caused by the abortive attempt in the 1970s by the government of Pierre Trudeau to nationalize the energy industry. After a great deal of strife in the 1990s, the Western elite have full control of the Conservative Party of Canada as their vehicle in national politics. They operate a patronage scheme via the resource companies in Western Canada, who are the key employers in the region. The Western elite hold their power in think tanks rather than classical academia. Organizations like the C.D. Howe Institute, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and the Canada West Foundation are where the policy thinking and intellectual posts for this group exist. These main groups constitute the political, financial, and academic centers of Canada, collectively setting the status quo for the entire nation. Any talk of establishing a Canadian identity must grapple with these entrenched interests, many of whom who have economic concerns diametrically opposed to the lives of old-stock Canadians.
I'm dreaming of an ethnogenesis where every soul finds its place, timeless rhythms in sweet synthesis.
There is a case to be made that the entire planet is slowly entering a post-nation state, be it organically, by persuasion, or occasionally by force. However, to have that conversation, we must acknowledge the existing power dynamics are evolving to an even more advanced configuration, one of supranational entities and technocratic orientations that are still revealing themselves. Canada, however, is proclaiming its citizens must naively abandon power dynamics entirely, with the assumption that the rest of the international community will follow our lead. In this scenario, Canada, being a loose grouping of ethnicities loyal to an effectively hollow central apparatus, will inevitably fall prey to the nearest coordinated aggressor. This could be America, this could be Russia, it could even be China. The nature of a modern society driven primarily by economic interests means it has very limited ability to project power externally or even internally. Due to the nature of Canada's socialist policies, it is this engine to which most Canadians are financially dependent.
In a new form of society, sovereignty is localized in administrative bureaus. They proclaim the rules, make the law, issue the decrees. The shift from Parliament to the bureaus occurs on a world scale. The actual directing and administrative work of the bureaus is carried on by new men, a new type of men. It is specifically the managerial type. The active heads of the bureaus are the managers in government, the same or nearly the same in training, functions, skills, habits of thought as the managers in industry.
As of 2024, 1 in 4 Canadians works for the federal government in one form or another. One of the most frequent arguments for increased immigration, aside from required growth of GDP, is that it provides a tax base through which to support the comprehensive welfare state established by the federal government. One which no political party, whether liberal, conservative, or independent, will ever move to threaten. But the strength of a nation is not measured by how many people are supported by the state. The ideal nation is not simply the most advanced welfare machine. The people must constitute the center of its power. To create a separate society is not to start with building a city and then populating it. Further, it is not about drafting a constitution and then asking people to adhere to it. Ethnogenesis begins more interpersonally. Therefore, we must have an essential understanding of the lifeblood of the nation the same way First Nations tribes do, being the intersection of ethnicity, culture, and geography. Can Canadians even fashion a new ethnic identity apart from its British and French roots, and more importantly, separate from America? Adrian Hastings presents a model of the nation that, counter to the modern claim of origins existing no further back than the 19th century, extends to the Middle Ages at least. While nations as we know them assumed their current structure in the modern era of statecraft, the thesis is that these would not have been possible without a self-awareness grounded in the people possessing the following characteristics. Firstly, ethnic history in a region. Secondly, a shared vernacular that has evolved to the written form, one with the ability to produce literature that allows these people to imagine themselves as a united ethnicity. Thirdly, a horizontal conceptualization of kinship.
A nation is a far more self-conscious community than an ethnicity, formed from one or more ethnicities and normally identified by a literature of its own. It possesses or claims the right to political identity and autonomy as a people. A nation-state is a state which identifies itself in terms of one specific nation whose people are not seen simply as subjects of the sovereign, but as a horizontally bonded society to whom the state, in a sense, belongs.
What do we mean by horizontal kinship? To better understand the components, we can turn to the schema outlined by David Hackett Fisher, whose book Albion's Seed provides a very robust cataloging of the 24 characteristics that define a folk. This accounting means that everything from how we utilize the hours in the day to how we balance religion with folk mythology strengthen an ethnic group, especially evident in North America, where settlers were transplanted in a completely unfamiliar terrain, yet were able to build a world apart. We must have answers to the following points. The characteristics of your speech, rules on how to build things, traditions concerning raising a family, customs for marriage, how gender is expressed, the roles of each sex, how children are generally raised, conventions for last names, attitudes towards age, rituals surrounding death, laws of your faith, beliefs concerning superstition and magic, the role of education, patterns of diet and food preparation, customs of dress, attitudes towards recreation and sports, work ethic, consensus on the importance of time, beliefs regarding wealth, how rank is distributed within the community, templated strategies for settlement and migration, the importance of order, then the importance of authority to enforce it, and lastly, prevailing ideas of liberty and restraint. If you can have a response for every element of the above list, you can count yourself as a distinct people. This is true even if you inherit cultural artifacts from your ancestors who may have seen themselves as wholly distinct from you presently, like the French and the Quebecois. Fulfilling this list is something old stock Canadians can certainly accomplish, as it's utilized by Aboriginals, African Americans, and various Asian subcategories encountered daily within our borders. Not all folk evolve into robust nations, and even those that do become nations struggle to ascend to the level of sophistication seen throughout Europe. There exists a higher level of unity, power centralization, and most importantly, self-awareness required to achieve full civilizational sovereignty. In other words, when someone pushes you, you have the internal command of momentum to push back. That is the end goal, even on a smaller scale, of pursuing sovereignty through organized identity. For a Canadian audience, the most immediate example of sociocultural projects within a nation will be the First Nations tribal bands. Many First Nations have their own elected band governments, which are responsible for administrating services to their members. Band governments are managed by elected councils according to the laws of the Indian Act. Bands function as local governments, which means they manage many of their own affairs, including education and infrastructure. While some bands choose to leave control of membership with the federal government, others opted to manage their own membership affairs, such as the Algonquins of the Pickawanagan First Nation. This meant that Indian status no longer automatically granted someone band membership, as it was left wholly up to the tribes. Another modern example is Orania, a town in the Northern Cape of South Africa. Formerly established in 1991, the town was created during the last years of apartheid, where it was meant to be a safe haven for Afrikaners. They are the ethnic group descended from the Europeans who colonized South Africa. They speak their own language, Afrikaan, and have their own currency permitted by the unique legal structure of South Africa. Their town of 1,600 has doubled in population over the last 7 years and is primed for constrained economic growth. The people, alternatively known as folk, peasants, citizens, or subjects, cannot merely be human capital within a monarchical power structure. On the contrary, they can survive on their own before, after, and outside of the state. The German people were an illustrative historical example of this, starting as a strong ethnic and cultural identity without a central bureaucratic infrastructure, while France approached a synthesis from the opposite direction by leading with the monarchy and later establishing its horizontality through revolution. Once a disorganized group bumped up against a nation, they quickly realized they too must collectivize and formalize simply to survive. Unification and centralization gathered strength against neighboring opponents. When you survey your political surroundings, do you detect horizontal unity? As a Canadian, is there any sort of national spirit that could exist if the liberal bureaucracy were to simply vanish tomorrow? If you believe it can be reduced solely to unity of skin color, you have not been paying attention. A Canadian people must generate itself apart from the state apparatus and outside of global courts. Many believe that the first step to freedom of identity is defeating the institutions that are aligned against them. A system collapse will not have the effect of awakening millions to their own yearnings of sovereignty, especially if this desire is not implanted there beforehand. Surveys show that as much as 61% of Canadians believe multiculturalism is essential to Canadian identity. There will be impassioned pushback against this sort of new nationalism you may be considering, the majority of it being people who look like you and share your background. You are building a brotherhood in the form of a thin archipelago in a hostile ocean. Your experience is like being caught between an old world which is decreasingly able to sustain us intellectually and spiritually, maybe even materially, and a new world that has not yet been born. You are a member of a hyper-aware public, which is separate from this vague ideological phenomenon known as the people. That gives you the power to start forming a nation right now, today. The people were always understood as everyone that stood outside of powerful organizations, and Marxist or anarchist agitators had an interest in making everyone believe they were on the exact same level outside of these power structures. You were part of an interchangeable mass of units that reverted to the natural mean through violence. The concept of the spontaneously organizing crowd all but disappeared during the age of mass communication and mass organization. It was reduced to a propagandistic tool of hierarchical organizations, mostly political parties and labor unions. It is an abstraction of political philosophy, always appealing to the ubiquitous everyman. The famous line, "We the people," in the preamble to the American Constitution was a rejection by the framers of the ultimate authority of state governments. The people themselves were eternally absent. Martin Gurry, former CIA analyst and author, explains there is no great mass of rational individuals known as the people. There's only a matrix of interconnected public groups, or publics. These can be seen as identity groups agitating for their interests rather than a single materialistic mass. Each public is not a fixed body of individuals, but a self-selected group clustered around an affair of interest that it defines itself by. These can be spiritual, political, ethnic, or likely an intersection of all three. This is evident both online and offline, and probably explains how you interface with politics on a daily basis.
Basically, the world that existed before you were really a conscious creature, you young ones, was very different from the one you live in today. It basically had been shaped by the industrial age. The industrial age believed in these steep hierarchies and scientific control of the bottom by an elite that was very wise and rational and decisive, and that solved problems. So they looked at even at politics as like a mathematical proposition, where there were problems to be solved. Unemployment is a problem. Inequality is a problem. Well, of course, if you look at these things, these conditions, that's what they are. They're not problems. Closely, you realize they're a very complex tangle of things, but that's not the way it was looked at in the industrial age. And that mindset, and it was not just government, it was the media, it was the scientific establishment, it was business. That mindset could be sustained because in those days, Le Monde, Le Figaro, you had a very limited amount of information, and each institution pretty much controlled its own domain of information.
The current crisis of authority that we can witness hollowing out existing institutions and questioning their validity didn't arise because these institutions prostituted themselves to power or money. That was an explanation after the fact, one that happened to be believed by much of the public and many experts. In reality, it was the painfully visible gap between the institution's claims of competence and their actual performance. Do you know anyone who has faith in the bureaucracy? From Brazil to Toronto to Moscow, is there a single government institution you can think of that isn't corrupted by grandiose ineptitude? What the public does in response to this state of affairs is revolt. It opposes, it attacks, it agitates against, but it does not propose. The groups that critique the system are not coherent enough to replace the system. These publics advocate for change but can never be placed in the seat of power or transplanted to replace the institutions they want to topple. It must evolve into that form at a later date, usually when an elite within that group emerges, like the Bolsheviks. These competing publics operate much like secret societies have throughout world history, which are also very close to how intellectual movements operate, especially if they are forced underground. Niall Ferguson studied how these decentralized cliques collectivize to eventually form mass movements, explaining how society is guided either covertly or overtly by the machinations of small groups outside but adjacent to the domain of system-approved politics. When these small groups coalesce into a coherent direction, they have the power to overwhelm the status quo politically, militarily, even religiously. While history is written by the victors, shadow groups are the inverse. The most successful networks are never known, while the failures are the tip of everybody's tongue.
In all these cases, there is another way of graphing the institution, graphing the organization, and that is its network structure. Who is really talking to whom? Who is really in a close relationship with whom? That network, whatever institution you're talking about, will look different from the org chart. And in the British Empire's case, although officially Queen Victoria was the empress of all she surveyed, that wasn't really how the British Empire worked. It wasn't as if she issued orders that were then carried out in lowly villages. Actually, the British Empire was built by networks of traders and networks of missionaries and networks of Oxford-educated Orientalists. It was very decentralized. It's pretty hard to control what's happening in India from London, even today.
How these groups gather strength through affiliation can be explained with graph theory, which in this application concerns itself with mapping interconnected relationships between people and the key vectors of communication, its applications encompassing everything from the study of systems of molecules to the spread of rumors. For our purposes, it maps the exchange of information between groups that otherwise have little reason to cooperate, guided as they are through their own internal relationship dynamics, goals, and values. This phenomenon could be tracked during the European Enlightenment, which, despite its reputation as a spontaneous wave of intellectual development that swept Europe, was much more geographically sequestered than one might assume. Different movements with disconnected intellectuals. These separate blocks grew a connective tissue of communication through letter exchange by key individuals, otherwise known as power nodes, dotted upon the graph. These power nodes are what make movements or revolutions coalesce, since the majority of groups simply do not form connections on their own. Paul Revere, one of only 2 men crossing the class divide between revolutionary Massachusetts, is the perfect study of a node effectively linking these sorts of clusters. In the conflict between an advanced state structure and the plethora of identity groups vying for influence in the Western multicultural experiment, neither side can wipe each other out. A resolution, when it comes, may well defy the terms of the struggle. Such a synthesis cannot be centrally controlled, it just happens on its own after a period of prolonged oppositional tension. After a long enough struggle, the synthesis happens whether you want it to or not. This conflict of groups aligned against a failing government doesn't necessarily need to assume the form of terrorism or violent revolution. It can be an affirmative project. Some have begun manifesting a conceptual movement going by many names: breakaway societies, parallel societies, or even what is referred to as a network state. This network state is defined as a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that purchases territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. How it achieves the funds for these acquisitions can include legitimate businesses, crowdfunding, or angel investment from within. Wielding this methodology, an online identity group can organize itself into political action with a stake in the real world, leveraging 21st century tools to create a nation within a nation. The most crucial part is forming communities that are geographically defined, using the digital realm as a filter. Beginning with a sufficiently dedicated online community, otherwise known as a public gathered around an identity, the following step is to organize it into what is termed a network union. Unlike a social network, a network union has one purpose: to coordinate its members for their mutual benefit. The goal is to resolve the question of long-term financial support so these groups do not end up turning to crime. Financial support is not the final destination of this group. America's religious colonies succeeded at a higher rate than its for-profit colonies because the former had a unifying spiritual purpose. This identity could be Christians of European descent, Eastern European Marxists, or perhaps Eurasian transhumanists. You're arguing that the culture of your new society is better than the surrounding culture. Implicitly, that means that there's some moral deficit in the world that you are attempting to fix. As we have seen with what constitutes a folkway, your shared identity demands something more than a mere ideology to bind together long term.
Never doubt that a small, committed group of people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, right? All the, when you actually get into history and you realize all these nations, these countries that exist today did have founders. They were founded, and in fact, the founding fathers, you know how old they were?
I mean, many of them, Alexander
late
Hamilton
20s,
was
early 30s, right?
Yeah, 21. Some of them were 19.
Yeah, some of them were quite young, right? Wow. So in the time and place, right, when the conditions were propitious, when there was a frontier, and when, the man met the moment, it was possible to found new countries, right? In fact, it's done within a human lifetime, when the Soviet Union fell.
An elegant way to get your arms around this project is by writing a one-line constitution to establish the most basic tenet that everyone must agree on, through which you define your social bonds. This isn't a document containing rules and laws. It must be the one thing everyone has to agree on. Concrete examples of possible one commandments include European Christianity equals good, or transhumanism equals bad. For our purposes, it could be Anglo-French frontiersmanship equals good. This is the nucleus you gather around, and a proposition where if you meet someone and they do not agree with this premise, you know you cannot count on them as an ally. If they attempt to deconstruct the premise, you most likely have an enemy. The next step is to develop a capacity for collective action in a single direction. This is tightly related to the concept of a national consciousness, and it's the utopian goal you all secretly possess. The Puritans wanted to build a city on the hill. The Japanese, after the Meiji Restoration, replaced their previous mission statement of revere the emperor, expel the barbarians with enrich the country, strengthen the military, turning their society around 180 degrees. You need an inspirational North Star because stasis is poison. If you simply bring people together and fail to move them towards a common goal, you will succeed in creating a cult of personality at best or an organized crime syndicate at worst. Both examples eventually jettison the original intention behind the group formation. The maintenance of a group is an exercise of struggle to achieve balance, especially if it is staffed by the sorts of minds attracted to radical action. One expert on group dynamics who rose to prominence alongside Freud and others in the early psychoanalytic movement, named Wilfred Bion, diverged from his contemporaries with his belief that the human was fundamentally a community-based organism. He understood that interrogating an individual one-on-one was a limited methodology to apprehend the underlying issues impacting a person's state of mind or their identity.
The apparent difference between group psychology and individual psychology is an illusion produced by the fact that the group brings into prominence phenomena which appear alien to an observer unaccustomed to using the group.
Bion drew a distinction between two types of groups based on his experiments, one being the work group and the second being the basic assumption group. The work group is defined as a group united by a mission or goal that they are working towards in unison, whereas a basic assumption group is given no clear direction and is left to define its own existence, allowing behavioral eccentricities and ideological priors to mutate over time. In his experiments, emotions such as anxiety, fear, hate, and love thrive in each basic assumption group, what's known as a proto-mental matrix, whereas these emotional drivers are suppressed within the work groups. It's extremely easy for groups to become cults of personality orbiting a single charismatic figure if no clear trajectory is given for their efforts. Conversely, the work group, through its primary concern with reality and a measurable result, is compelled to employ practical strategies despite the influence of the exact same emotional drivers, and sometimes working in harmony with them. One is a group that defines its existence by its ability to declare itself, while the other defines its existence by its ability to effectively complete a project. The trick is that once the project is completed or the mission is accomplished, a new trajectory must be provided to ensure the group does not become dependent on these basic assumptions or ideological priors. This is true for military operations and revolutionary secret societies alike. You must always be moving, you must always be growing. Stasis is infighting, purity spiraling, blood feuds, and one giant circular firing squad. Once you have a schematic for what you need to build, the next crucial step is acquiring an archipelago of physical territories. This is the necessary physical footprint of your state, perhaps even your new homeland. Rather than buying one massive tract of land, you may consider purchasing several smaller parcels in geographically advantageous positions, remembering that all the most ideal port cities and vantage points are most likely already occupied. The aim is to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition by exerting geographic control, which requires your putative state to have clout, and clout is in turn established by a publicly verifiable census of population, income, and real estate to prove that your growing society is as large as you say it is. If you can't map your tribe onto the real world, you may as well be a fandom. Above all else, you are endeavoring to broadcast one simple truth. It is easier to negotiate with you than it is to steamroll you. How you marshal these defenses is best left for another time, since this is the stuff of parallel economics and guerrilla warfare. Suffice to say, it will require a martial class of men to represent the ferocity of this emergent spirit. What we have explored is but one hypothesis for how you can gather a new seed of kinfolk from a public sphere obsessed with tearing down illegitimate institutions and fashioning it into a work group that can form a legitimate real-world nation-state. While this nation within a nation is one way to elbow your way to a seat at the table, being seated there brings a lot of attention and perhaps even aggression. The opportunities presented here are some examples of how to get started. Still, it demands you know who you are, what you are, where you are, and what you have at your disposal to demand respect from a world that grants nothing as a matter of course. Institutions lack the ability to define what a Canadian is, and it is up to you to present it to them in the form of victory. They may become your allies after you achieve your goals, but they are not even capable of fighting on your behalf. The nature of the modern state is that its primary focus will always be advocating for itself. You must meet it at a comparable scale. They lack the language, they lack the historicity, and they lack the time horizon necessary to engage this sort of grand project. You can appeal to no existing power structure to grant it for you. You cannot vote for it. Your existence is not a negotiation. This grand project seeks to utilize practical strategies to create a distinct ethnos from a historically unique multicultural pool that, rather than harken back to a commoditized tradition or admiration of low-resolution tribes, thrives in the current historical period with a distinct utilization of old stock Canadiana. This project endeavors to create a folk that has the capability to ascend to the status of a nation and to achieve sovereignty in a world where new and terrifying forms of power are emerging. If all we have been is becoming, perhaps we can then hold Canada to its sorrowful promise, a promise of becoming.